All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first in a two-part series of study skills with Edrolo. My name is Lyndon. I'm a former chemistry teacher. I was using Edrolo with my students and getting a lot of value from the resource, from the platform before coming and jumping and joining the company so I can spend time with students like yourselves to ensure you guys are getting the most from it. It's making a real impact on your learning in your final years of school. So as I said, this is the first part in a two-part series of webinars. This one today, we're going to be focusing on understanding, memorizing the content in the lead up. You've got your mock exams probably coming at the end of this term, and then of course your QCE final exams midway through next term. But the start of next term, when we're sort of that 3 or so weeks out from your exams, we're going to be having a second webinar, which really focuses on that examination technique. How do you actually prepare for the exam itself? And we're going to be covering some more things in there. So keep an eye on your inbox when that will come out, probably end of this term or during the holidays. But yeah, welcome this afternoon. I've got my colleague and guest here, Zoe. She recently completed year 12. She now works for Edrolo, helping write our year 7 and 8 maths book, but she's also our resident exam coach. So she actually works with year 12 students and helps them perform as best they can throughout their final year of school. So she's studying teaching at uni at the same time as that as well. So she's got a lot going on, but she's got a whole bunch of ideas that are going to be really helpful for you as you prepare for your exams. And so grab a pen, be ready to take notes. She's going to cover heaps of stuff, but be thinking about what is the stuff that resonates with you and that you want to start using in this next week and as you get towards your exams. So as we're going through, if you have questions, I'm going to be sitting in on the chat box, but what I want you to do is actually use the Q&A function, so make sure we don't miss any questions. We'll also give you maybe 10 minutes at the end to ask any questions that you have too, but please just use that Q&A function, which you'll be able to find in the Zoom window there, and submit your questions there. So I'm going to hand it over to Zoe, and you'll see me again at the end of the webinar for the Q&A. I'll come join Zoe then too, but Zoe, let me hand it over to you. Thanks very much for being with us today, and we'll leave these guys in your very capable hands.
Okay, let's see that the slide's working. It is. Well, thank you for that introduction, Lyndon. Before I talk a little bit about myself, I thought I'd get right into what I hope you're going to get out of today. So to start off, we're going to learn how to memorize information quickly over long periods of time using very counterintuitive but still effective techniques. We'll also learn how to deeply understand content faster using structural priming. We'll also look at ways that me and my clients kick procrastination, stay motivated, and wisely use our time. It's a mix of stuff that works for us and tips that leverage scientific research. Now, I only have half an hour, so you may need to go ahead and research these concepts a little bit yourself after the session. So I'm going to give you some suggested resources to do that. Remember that we're also concluding with a 10-minute Q&A, so please write down your questions and put them in using the Q&A function. I'm also here to show you how we can enact techniques using Edrolo. Typically, I don't like plugs myself, but really Edrolo is that good. But firstly, a bit of background about me. I'm from Victoria and I graduated in 2020 with an ATAR of 99.45. I mainly did maths and science subjects, but my best result was in a linguistics subject called English language. Basically, this is a lot like a mesh between English and humanities subjects in your own states. Now I'm studying teaching at Monash, doing year 12 performance coaching and tutoring, and I'm working on maths textbooks at Edrolo. Now, the reason I share this with you is not to say that I have all the answers, but because I have been where you are, and I was able to use a bunch of successful strategies to get through year 12 and do pretty well. This is what I want to share with you today. I got my ATAR in what was a pretty tough year for me personally. Yes, there were COVID lockdowns, but I also had my grandmother, who I lived with, become really sick and need some more intensive care. So, believe me, I am well aware that there's more to year 12 than study, and that things can and do go horribly wrong. Ultimately, what got me through was managing myself to get work done and to remain motivated, as well as working smart using research-backed study techniques. This is the major reason I do Year 12 performance coaching now. Outside of my work and study, I find balance through my family and friends and ballroom dancing. I really encourage you to find your thing and make sure there's more to your life than work. But on to business, people. I'm hoping that you're here because you're realizing that you want to get better results than you currently are. So you're open to different ways of doing things. Still, I think this is a timely reminder. What I'm sharing today is, I dare say, different to what you were already doing. But basically, if you want to improve your marks, you are going to need to change your strategy. Let's start with how we memorize the stuff we study. Now, memorization in and of itself is not sufficient. After all, never ever memorize anything you don't understand. However, memorization is still super important. Why? Because it frees up working memory for things that are in the middle of your exam. Yeah. So take, for example, your English exam essay, right? Where you have to use quotes from the book. Struggling to remember a quote that you half remember not only wastes valuable time, but also means that your brain is so occupied with trying to remember something that it is not thinking critically about the prompt, it is not remembering your mental plan, and it is definitely not checking your written expression. This is the precise reason our maths teachers make us memorize times tables and key number facts. Maths is hard enough without having to figure out 8 times 6 is 48 each time. Also, rote memorization of information like definitions reduces the margin of error if you're asked to supply that in the exam. So I guess think of memorization as automation. The more stuff we make automatic, the more we can redirect our brain to other things. Like most people, I began my learn to study journey with making summaries in my own words. I would then rewrite a more condensed version of that summary and then another more condensed version of that summary to make sure that it was active learning. I thought this automatically made it very effective, but in reality, it was a fun activity for a stationary fiend. I rewarded myself with Tombow calligraphy pens, mild liner highlighters, and Muji gel pens. Then I actually congratulated myself for being productive. In the early days, I was operating under the delusion that not only was I understanding and retaining the information, but the more pages in my summary, the more tangible proof of how productive I'd been. But we should not measure productivity by the page. When I looked at my outcomes and started digging deeper, I came to realize that summaries were the sugar of my studying diet. Not entirely without sustenance, but certainly not the healthiest food we could be having. Here's something that is unfortunately true. Science shows us that we are terrible at objectively judging what study methods are best for us. The hardest way to learn feels easy, and the easiest way to learn feels hard. This sounds very unintuitive, especially given the common but false advice that we should find what works best for us to fit our own personal learning style. The reality is this: good study techniques force our brains to build connections. This encodes information more strongly, resulting in more reliable and faster recall. The process of forcing these connections feels hard. Bodybuilders know that it's at the point when lifting weights starts to feel difficult that the real muscle development begins. So, let your mental resistance to a certain approach be a guide. If you don't want to do it, you are probably on the right track. When we do easier study like highlighting and note-taking, we genuinely feel like stuff is going in, but really, this is just familiarity. That's why open book note-taking has limited effectiveness for memory. When researchers compare study methods, it falls around the middle of the pack. And that is for people who are being formally trained in the art of summarizing after years at university. The average high school student? No way. It's certainly more effective than rereading or highlighting, but there are significantly more efficient and effective ways we can be using our time. So, if summaries are sugar, what's kale? Our brains are wired to trigger us into feeling we need copious amounts of sugar, but the food which is best for us is often bitter. The kale of study is testing yourself from memory. This is seasoned with spaced out practice and cooked in deep understanding. Okay, I'm getting a bit carried away with the metaphor, but just stick with me here. The proper name for self-testing is active recall. You may have heard of active versus passive learning. This is pretty much as active as it gets. Flashcards, test at school, literally any time you've had to remember any information without looking at notes. All of these are variants of active recall. It is the single most effective study principle ever discovered, as demonstrated by a mountain of research. Why does it work? The way that the brain makes long-term connections is based around how much you retrieve information from your brain. We all have this misconception that in order to study, we have to put stuff into our brains. But it's actually flipped on its head when you look at the neuroscience. If you look at the evidence, the actual way to remember and learn anything is to retrieve information from our brains rather than these relatively doomed attempts to put it back in. So then we supercharge this by doing this again, repeatedly, over time, but at very specific intervals. This is called spaced repetition. A lot of people who cram a few weeks from the exam will revise the same information many more times than is shown in this graph. But these people actually recall the information more poorly than people who review the same information less, but space it out more. This, again, is very unintuitive. Why does it work? This is explained by the forgetting curve, which has been really well established in psychology for over 1 century. The forgetting curve is the idea that over time, we forget things at an exponential rate without an intervention from us. The way we can take advantage of the forgetting curve is breaking the cycle by reviewing material at spaced intervals. In essence, the idea behind spaced repetition is that you allow your brain to forget some of the information. This ensures that the active recall process is remaining hard. Remember that the harder your brain has to work to retrieve information, the more likely it is that information will be encoded. The more that we practice and the more spaced this repetition becomes, the more likely we are to remember. Okay, so the easiest and cheapest way to implement this is to put the content you need to remember into an app called Anki. This is a free tool on your laptop. Now, you can pay a lot of money to have it on a tablet or a phone, but the desktop version is literally the same. All you have to do is open the app every day, and it will space rep the information for you, taking into account how easily you remember stuff. Basically, it makes active recall and spaced repetition idiot-proof. I highly recommend this. Honestly, if you've got Edrolo, exams from QCAR, and Anki, you've got pretty much all you need to nail the QCE. So I can't give you a demo now, but there are lots of excellent ones on YouTube. Pro tip, the best ones are usually by medical students. Memorization is all well and good, but it is nowhere near as important as deeply understanding the material. Never, ever memorize something without understanding it first. Now, the most efficient way to acquire a deep understanding of any content is not summary making, but a combination of pre-study called structural priming and then learning the content in layers. Hopefully you've been through most of the content already, and now you're mainly just filling in gaps. You still can reap the benefits of pre-study as the first step in your revision though. Structural priming. Essentially, you're building a hierarchy of information while creating relationships across broad ideas. This is looking at the syllabus and then breaking down the information to provide a structure, which you can then work from systematically. Textbooks do this a bit, but I recommend using a visual aid like tree diagrams and mind maps or a digital tool. Personally, I use Notion. Then I would check this against the Edrolo video list, which does this to a much greater extent. Categorization really breaks down the material instead of learning it as one large trunk. You could visualize this body of knowledge as a tree with every branch extending into ever smaller branches. What you're doing is essentially priming your brain to build relationships faster because you've got a broad overview of the content and the ideas you're going to be covering. And ultimately, a lot of what you're assessed on comes from a deep understanding of those relationships. Importantly, it's going to be super helpful in identifying high yield information, which is something we're going to cover in a little bit. Also, you're going to have improved recall of that information as a result of this structure. Essentially, it's the difference between trying to find a shirt in a massive pile of all your clothes on the floor and finding it in a well-organized closet. You'll find it easier in the closet, right? Likewise, you'll find whatever piece of information you're looking for in your structure. A point I want to drive home here is that pre-study should not be a massive use of your time. You shouldn't be learning the nitty-gritty details of the subject yet. Structural priming ideally takes place before you learn the material, but maybe for you guys, it's going to be before you embark on any further revision. Trust me, it's still helpful. This technique has saved myself, my students, and my friends doing courses like med, like 10 to 20 hours. Seriously, it's worth doing. So here is a super simple but effective example of how we can implement this. This works well in bio for sure, but I also did this in a linguistics subject. So I'm just going to play this and you can see how this medical student has used it. Oh, let's try this. Okay, I'm not sure I can get this video to work, but I will send it to you after. I'll see if I can skip through the video and show you what he did. Bear with me. Okay. Alrighty, so this is for his medical course. There's the broad subject, hematology, and he found that he could break it down into 3 key themes, and that each of these broke down into a few sub-themes, and he got that from his syllabus and a couple of other sources. Then, when he had a super specific example that was in his exam question, he could file it immediately under each one of these headings. This gave him a wealth of information that he'd already memorized, so he could notice the patterns between stuff and be like, oh yeah, this is quite similar to this example, so I am going to use a similar method. So this is quite a simple example, but I feel that it really illustrates the value of this. Okay, so next point, learning occurs in layers. You start with your hierarchy, then revisit the information again and again with a certain goal. Like, now I've got the gist of it, I want more detail, or I don't understand this particular mechanism. Now, this is going to be different for different people. Personally, I taught myself all of the content for all of my subjects by semester 2 and treated my lessons thereafter as revision lectures. Some people may be pressed for time and can't do this many layers. This is just a sample structure. The point is, you have a logical process you follow for understanding everything in the course. And between stages, you know what your questions are and attempt to answer them by following the next layer in the process. That's what this orange arrow represents. And the reason I love Edrolo so much as a student and now as someone working for them is because it is an amazingly useful resource at each of these stages. It breaks down the syllabus into subtopics and videos. So you have a great deal of categorization already done for you. You can watch the videos ahead of class so that you can treat class like a revision lecture or come to class prepared with questions. You can also dip into Edrolo as required to answer your own questions, or you can test your understanding with the self-rating tool, something we're going to be covering in a bit, as well as Edrolo's high-quality exam-style questions. If you do end up doing that, a useful strategy can be to make a note of which bits of information are still confusing so that when you chat to a teacher, you know exactly what your question is. Never, ever let a question slide. Now, is Edrolo a magic bullet? Of course not. But you already have access to Edrolo, so it would be a massive waste not to use such a high quality resource. It is also syllabus aligned and provides comprehensive alternative explanations to your own teacher, so you don't need to invest in tutors. This combined with practice exam questions, video solutions, and a range of really intuitive and helpful features, plus your teachers will give you all the tools you really need to succeed in QCE. Having a core resource saves you time in reading subpar material to try and get a concept. This enables you to move on to the main business of exam prep much, much faster. After all, I'm not saying that you don't need an information source. Of course, you need to sit down, figure out what to memorize, and have that recorded somewhere, ideally on Anki flashcards. What I am saying is that the compilation process should be done as quickly as possible. It's there to tell you what to memorize, rather than to help you memorize that information. So here's how I go about it using Edrolo. So I tell my students to prioritize the stuff they memorize based on 2 key characteristics. Number 1, what is explicitly identified on the syllabus, not tangents that help you understand it, like case studies and stuff like that. That's worth hearing when you're learning the material for the first time, but you don't need it memorized for an exam, especially when you're pressed for time. Number 2, what comes up a lot, which you find out by checking out the marking guides early on. So, yeah, that slide showed up. One of the things I get my students to do before they start compiling info is to go to the marking guide and past exams and gather approved definitions and explanations from the guidelines to memorize word for word on Enki. Now, you may need to modify these in the middle of your exam slightly to tailor to the question, but ultimately it frees your working memory or brain space to be thinking critically about your exam rather than try and get your wording right to meet the criteria. It also means that you've got the high frequency concepts already solid in your memory. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily neglect the whole syllabus. Edrolo gives you study notes already aligned to the syllabus, ready for your exams. Once you've understood stuff and you're ready to get to the memorizing part, get the bits that line up with the dot points, make an Anki flashcard, and just get cracking. These are the subjects that we have Edrolo courses for in the QCE. If you do one of these and don't have Edrolo for it, ask your teacher to get in touch with us and we can set up a free trial for your class. Now for a bit of a change, let's talk about motivation, time management, and procrastination. Here are two of the major problems I see: overscheduling, which is taking on too much in a time frame, and procrastination. They're definitely related. Overscheduling leads to feelings of, I can't do this, so it's not worth it, and thus procrastination. Procrastination means we have more stuff to do in less time, so that leads to overscheduling. The resolution to both is quite similar. Schedule study last. After school hobbies, etc. go in first. This means that you will have a realistic idea of how much study you're going to do. If you end up skipping some of the other things you schedule, fantastic, more time for study. Just don't plan on it. When you're scheduling, I would recommend against making task-based to-do lists. Believe me when I say everything takes longer than you think, and all you can really commit to is spending time on something, not completing it. I moved away from daily to-do lists, which for me were a recipe for unfulfilled expectations and disappointment. Instead, I did time blocking and systems. Like, it's better to say that I will spend an hour revising for my physics test than to assume I would complete a set of questions in that time. I also liked routines like when I first get up, I will try a maths exam every day. But what's really better than any of that time management stuff for me personally is considering priorities, which helps both overscheduling and procrastination. The most important way I did this was called the one thing principle. It's actually very simple. While you're having your morning coffee or tea, you ask yourself, what is the one thing I can do today that is going to have the most impact on my ATAR? Then just make it happen as soon as you can. There is other advice out there that says you should start with something to gain momentum, like note-taking or easy homework. This has some merit and may well work for you, but oftentimes I found that I worked all day and gained little. The one thing principle helped keep frustration in check, identified areas requiring more work, and just built confidence that I would be ready for my final exams. It's similar to the pay yourself first principle in investing, where you put your money away into long-term savings before you do anything else with your money. In year 12, the best forms of long-term saving are getting ahead and practice exams. So I got up early to study and do practice exams every day, even if there was an internal assessment task. And you know what? Some days, maybe the best thing you can do for your ATAR is take a day off because you're exhausted. That's okay. This means that you can do what you need to do without guilt. How do we know what one thing to do though? Now we have some awareness of the best techniques that you can use and where they fit roughly in the study process. You can use that knowledge to get bang for buck. If you're still working through content, you can target areas of weakness. An old but good technique for doing this is self-rating. You can use a traffic light system with your syllabus like this, or a Edrolo self-rating tool, which has the added bonus of being visible to your teachers. So you're giving yourself and your teacher data. You can see all your ratings at a glance in the study planner, and it's good that you're prompted to check in with yourself every time you do content. One piece of the puzzle is leftover procrastination, motivation on a day-to-day basis. Now, pretty much everything I say here is better presented by the man, the myth, the legend, Dan Pink in his TED Talk. Please check this out in your own time. It's amazing. Still, I'll go through some key parts here and applications for you. Internal motivation is stuff like, I'm studying physics because I love physics and I want to learn more. External motivation is stuff like, I'm studying to get a good ATAR and not going any further than that. No prizes for guessing that internal motivation trumps external motivation most of the time. So internal motivation breaks down into three key parts when you listen to Pink. So we have autonomy, which is the need to self-direct and to not be imposed upon. Sometimes we don't like doing things that we have to do. So when we reframe it as a personal choice, we take back our autonomy. I have a short script here. I don't have to do this. It's my choice. Am I going to choose to do it? Next is mastery. This is one of the big ones for me as a student, and also explains why we tend to like things that we're good at. We already feel as though we're doing well and getting better, and we want to keep on getting better so we can continue to feel good about ourselves and our abilities. We also may have developed a love for what we're doing, and we want to get better at it because it fascinates us. But we can still leverage mastery even if we're not good at something yet, by believing that we are using effective techniques, so we will get better every time we study. So I have another short script here. If I proceed with a study session, I know I'll improve. Am I willing to forego that improvement? Finally, we have purpose, and this one far outstrips the other two as being the most effective internal motivator. I've written it down as the ability to connect to a larger cause, but for me, it was about finding my deeper why and connecting everything I do to that. Maybe you can't do this yet because you're still figuring that out. In that case, you'll need to relate to the other two a little bit more. But if you do have that deeper why and that sense of purpose, then that is an incredible thing to leverage. I turn that script in, I am doing this because, where you end that sentence with, not because my teacher told me to, but because in my case, I want to be the best teacher I can be, and I want to learn all the powerful knowledge I can so I can share that with my students. When you feel yourself going off task, go through these three scripts, write them down and put them on your wall if that works for you. See how appealing that YouTube video is afterwards. One last thing on procrastination. It's never just one TikTok or Instagram post or YouTube video. Here's a quick story. My family friend Pam quit smoking. How did she do it? She said to herself one day, fine, Pam, buy that cigarette. But it's not just that cigarette, it's a whole packet. And she might have been able to say no before to that one cigarette, but say no to a whole packet, much, much easier. Now, I'm not quite equating TikTok with smoking, but what I am saying is that every time you want to go off task and open an app, you are effectively kissing the next 2 hours goodbye. Suddenly, it's much easier to say, I am not willing to do that. Before I start wrapping up, I just want to say that all of this stuff is well and good and important, but ultimately, unless you're struggling, most of your time between now and the exam should be spent on exam-style questions if you're wanting a high mark. Get them from Edrolo, past exams, teachers, study guides, whatever. But basically, the more of these you do, the better your mark is. I can't go too much more into this though, because that is next session's topic. Okay, so if you liked what I had to say today, here's some things that we are going to go through next time. We have exam technique, we have getting the most out of your practice questions, and we have minimizing the time you do practice via post-exam autopsies. If you want to research any of the concepts I introduced today, here are a few of my favorite resources. These will all get sent to you after. Okay, do I have enough time? I think I do. Okay, so let me just wrap up with this. It's pretty likely that you've heard about fixed versus growth mindsets. If that resonates with you, great. If it doesn't, think of it this way. Ultimately, what cognitive science and neuroscience tells us is that we have much more in common with each other and the smartest student in the class than we don't. We have the same cognitive architecture of working memory, long-term memory, and similar abilities to handle new pieces of information at once. We also pretty much process things the same way, which is why theories like learning styles of visual, kinesthetic, etc. were debunked pretty brutally. You're not limited by your current abilities. Your ability to learn and retain information is pretty malleable. It's all about how you leverage your brain and how it works rather than your innate IQ. Similarly, if you're working part-time, something's gone wrong in your home situation, and you're losing hours every day to public transport, you're definitely going to have less time than some other students you're competing against. But again, what do you do with the time you have left? If it is the most effective high-yield study practices out there, and you're using your time with your teachers effectively, in all likelihood, you can do just as well or even better than someone who's basically studying full-time with less effective techniques. I don't think we have time for a biggest takeaway, so I think we'll just go straight to the Q&A.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you very much, Zoe. There's so much gold that you've covered there. And yeah, we're keen to give you guys some space now here on the call to have, it's about 10 minutes to ask any questions that you might have. So if you can use the Q&A function and put in your questions there, we'll make sure that we can get to as many as possible. I will be sending through the recording and the slides that Zoe's used, as well as those additional resources she's mentioned, through to you guys in an email. But while you've got us here, I can make the most of it and chuck your questions in there. Also keen to hear if there's anything that really stood out to you that you thought was most valuable for this, or in this session. Chuck that in there too. We're very, very keen to hear that. So I'll just give you a moment to put your questions in, and we'll get to those. While you're doing that, I might just share my screen for a second, and we'll see here. Zoe mentioned using the marking guides. So these are available to everyone. If you just Google like QCE Biology Marking Guide, you'll see this come up. And so what Zoe was showing is it's got the exam questions. So if we scroll through multiple choice, these ones here. So it's got the exam question, or what question number, the sample response, and then how that response is marked. So looking through here and getting those tips, or if there's particular definitions, using this is the sample that the markers are giving you. And so this is one of those ways you can grab those definitions, memorize them, and as I was saying, reduce your working memory when you're trying to analyze a question in the exam. If you've got that ready to go, you can use it and just apply it to the question rather than trying to remember, what does genotype mean again?
Yeah.
So yeah, easily, if you just type in your subject, name, and then QCE marking guide or QCAR marking guide, you'll find that online.
I'm guessing we don't really have any questions. Cool.
Yeah, if there's any other things you want us to run through, or Zoe to go back through from the session, now's your chance.
Oh, we have something. How did you deal with nerves going into exams? Yeah, I get that a lot. And I definitely suffered with this myself. My big thing is doing enough practice exams and ideally getting it to the point that you are under the exam time. For example, when I was doing my first, we called them Unit 3 and 4 subjects in my state, but essentially Year 12 subject. My very first subject I did accelerated, and that was biology, and I was so nervous. So I just did so many practice exams, and I got it to the point where personally I was doing them 1 hour early. So I basically did the exam in 1.5 hours versus 2.5 hours. Now, not everybody can achieve that. And again, I was doing accelerated, so I had time to do that much practice. But the more practice exams you do and the better you do in those practice exams, the better you're going to feel going into your real exams. Another point, you know, when you're lining up outside the exam hall ready to go in, probably in order of student number or something like that, I would definitely recommend standing away from other people, because a lot of people just go into panic, like, oh my God, my life's over. I'm going into this English exam and I have no idea what I'm going to do. And everybody just starts getting into that panic sort of energy. You really should not be around those people, and you should definitely not engage in that conversation, because that is going to make you more nervous going in, and that really, really does affect your performance. So in summary, do enough practice and try and get it under time if you can. Look at how well you're doing in your exams, because the more exams you do, the better your results are going to be. Have confidence because you're using effective practices, and just keep away from people who are panicking. There's a difference between sharing concerns about stress in the correct time and place. If you're, talking to a friend a week before the exam or something like that, you can certainly help them deal with that stress. But if it's a few minutes before the exam, or even that's the same day or the night before, you kind of just got to look out for yourself and your own mental health, and don't let them stress you.
Yeah, great advice there, Zoe. And as well, let's remember this is an opportunity to show what you can do, like what you've learned. It's not something that could be scary and stressful. It's you've applied yourself, you've been learning things throughout this last year, and so use this as a chance to show what you can do. Yeah, so I think approaching that positive light rather than sort of scary, I'm going to get marked on this sort of way, can be a really helpful way to think about it as well. There's a question here. Well, first of all, a comment that was, yeah, love the active recall information. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. And then another question here around Anki flashcards and what they look like. We'll send through you a link to that so you can jump in and have a look yourself and start using those.
We'll find a one of the better medical school videos, and I'll do that because, as I said, like most medical students I know, and certainly the ones on YouTube, have got this down to a fine art. Like, they have such efficient systems for creating flashcards and really varied ways of doing it as well, depending on how close you are to the exam. For example, if you're cramming and you don't have time to go through and make your flashcards perfectly with perfect wording beyond maybe what's on the marking guides, they just make the question and just Google the answer. And it's like, do I know the information versus have I taken notes on it? Little tips like that. I got all of that from medical students, and they have really great videos, add-ons, all of that stuff. So short answer is I'll send you a video.
We've also got another question here around any advice if you've fallen behind. So at this point, mock exams coming up, not too distant future, and QCE exams, we're about a term away. What if you're feeling like you're behind, you've missed out on work?
Yeah.
Any strategies there?
I would definitely say prioritize understanding the content and learning it. Definitely go through it. I guess it also depends on the subject, right? How you would approach maths would definitely differ from how you approach, I don't know, a humanities subject or something or maybe even biology or something like that. But just speaking generally, go through that learning in layers process. Ultimately, you've kind of got a bit of an opportunity here, because when you do structural priming, it's actually going to be very, very effective for you. Yes, it's good for everybody else too, but it's going to be particularly useful for you. So go through the syllabus as your very first step and identify the key themes across it and make your little tree diagram. Like, I definitely recommend that you watch those videos I'm going to send you, because I didn't have time to go through it in as much detail as I'd like today. So do that, then learn in layers, going through that process I outlined, or modifying that to work for your situation with the amount of time you've got, how fast you learn information, all of that. Make use of your teacher. One of the best pieces of advice I received, especially as someone who wasn't in a position to have tutors, is make your teacher your tutor. So I would go and with a tutor, like normally you would ask them for help with homework or to mark stuff. Do that with your teacher and make use of them, as they are definitely your best resource. Anything else? Be very mindful of what questions you have, and that is the best way to speed up learning. So every time you go through a material, go through it with your questions in mind. So for example, okay, I really don't understand this aspect of natural selection. So when you're watching the Edrolo video on natural selection, you are going through it with that in mind. Or even if you're just going from your syllabus, okay, the syllabus requires that I explain the steps of natural selection. I am watching the video with, I want to explain the steps of natural selection in mind. So that really targets it and minimizes the amount of time you have to go through materials. In terms of memorization, if you've fallen behind, you're probably going to have less time to do that. So this is not, I guess, ideal, but I would definitely recommend rote learning the stuff that is on the marking guides as a top priority over anything else. So if you can't memorize everything in the course, that is definitely the best place to start and will get high coverage for your exam. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say. If it's maths, be very mindful that maths is cumulative. So don't just skip through the content and be like, okay, I've done that area of study in 1 hour and now I'm going to move on to the next one. No, you need to make sure that you've got a decent level of mastery of earlier concepts before you go on to the next concepts. But to know what concepts are required for future concepts, you should, number one, go to your syllabus and see where the relationships are. And number two, you should speak to your teacher. And I think that especially in maths, it's really worth working with your teacher very closely to figure out where your areas of weakness are and where to spend your time wisely. Yeah. Anything to add to that, Lyndon?
Yeah, just re-emphasising as a teacher myself, I'm there to help you. You're not going to get a teacher that's like, go away, I'm not going to give you assistance. If you've got a student coming to you, being proactive, wanting help and that extra guidance, well, they're going to
find another teacher in your school, because basically teachers really are there to help.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we're just past 5:10, so we might wrap it up there. Thank you, Zoe, so much for sharing not only the presentation, all those great ideas and strategies you've run through, but sharing your wisdom there for those Q&A that came through also. So really appreciate that. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. As I said, we'll send through those additional resources and those videos Zoe's mentioned. We'll put the recording in there as well, along with the slides. So if you want to go back to any of those things, and then keep an eye on your inbox for part 2 of our webinar series coming up in a couple of months' time. So thank you very much again for joining us. Have a fantastic afternoon, and thank you, Zoe.
Thanks, guys, and best of luck with your exams.